This episode, I'm joined by Jacob McMillan to discuss the philosophy of Philip Mainlander, Arthur Schopenhauer, and Eternism. Jacob's thesis is now live on Substack, which is linked in the description below. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paying patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you'd like to support the podcast and keep everything running, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy.
So, Jacob McMillan, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to be discussing the work of Arthur Schopenhauer and Philip Mainlander, primarily from your very recent thesis, Individuation and Death Between Mainlander and Schopenhauer, which you wrote for your undergraduate thesis in philosophy. And this is probably one of the, I'm going to assume, I haven't done too much research into this aspect of it because it's very difficult where Mainlander is concerned. But I'm going to assume this is one of the very early English documents on on Schopenhauer and Mainlander, simply because for so long we have had nothing in translation of substantial of Mainlander's until the very recent translation of the Philosophy of Redemption. So hopefully from that a lot more is going to be written, a lot more scholarship is going to arise on Mainlander, but yeah, that's what we're going to be discussing. Very cheery. So yeah, Jacob, tell us a little bit about yourself. What did you do, and the how was it that such a thesis came about?
Well, I mean, right now I'm in the sort of like tertiary grey area between like having handed the thesis in and actually getting the certificate as I finished my degree. But I think like Mainlander's kind of an internet almost legend for the like in pessimistic circles in like literature and philosophy. So like I think a lot of people have read like that. I think it was under U. Hunter, that translation of like various parts of the first work in the appendix. But so I've been interested in that I've been interested in him for a long time, and I was like just eagerly waiting for Christian's translation to actually appear. But I've been interested in I think pessimistic philosophy for a while now. But I also found myself really interested in the question of temporality more generally, and the reason I wanted to combine Mainlander and Schopenhauer is I think they both offer two sides of a coin that was left implicit in Kant's first critique, because he's a very strange writer in that first book, about what it means to be an individuated being in the universe, and also just to, like, as you said, like I want to be one of the first people to properly talk about this in the Anglophone world, and I want more attention to be given to him because I think he's a really valuable thinker that academia could really take a lot from. He's not just a bleak poet who ended his life in a dramatic and often misrepresented way. He's a lot more than that. So yeah, I wanted to do that justice.
And he's also, a lot of people who are interested in the work of Schopenhauer, it's often that if you are explicitly interested in the work of Schopenhauer, you often come to a bit of a full stop where Schopenhauer is concerned. You don't really know where to go from him. And Mainlander is, I mean, you could move from Schopenhauer, but perhaps not philosophically. You might move over to Ligotti, you might move over to Lovecraft even. You might move over to some bleak French poets or Charon or someone of this vein. But philosophically, continuing that discussion of Schopenhauer's understanding of Kant, you don't always know where to go. And any figures that did move from that position are much like Mainlander. Would find most of them in Weiser's book, right, on German pessimism.
Yeah.
And again, not much in translation at all. So we sort of now have, we could say, a Schopenhauerian disciple in translation. So if you want to get bleaker, well, we can discuss this idea of bleakness, because it's actually where I wanted to begin, because we did have a chat before we started this recording a few days ago, and one thing you said intrigued me, and you sort of repeated it just now. Mainlander as misrepresented, and you said to me that this idea really of him, sure, bleakness is there, but this idea of him as, I think you said to me that actually his writing is kind of did you even say joyous? Like, is joyous to read? So, what do you mean by the Mainlander misrepresentation?
I think well, for one, I think the sort of blanket assumption would be, and it's the first sentence of Beiser's writing on him. One of the first sentences is that he writes that Mainlander alone was able to take pessimism to its ultimate conclusion, which is suicide, which is biographically, obviously there's an account to make for that, but in his writings, he is, I think, where pessimism is concerned, it goes more into embracing fatalism really, really wholly. And, which specifically, people think that I guess that endpoint is that he advised suicide in his writings. I think that's usually the endpoint of pessimism that people think of in general and people explicitly associate with Mainlander. But he explicitly does not say that pessimism should endorse suicide. He writes exactly that he calls this philosophy the immanent philosophy. Mm-hmm. And he writes that the immanent philosophy had to destroy any counter motives to suicide. And he doesn't say that people shouldn't, but his ethics, is similar to Schopenhauer's. It's an ethics of love and it's an ethics of compassion, to suggest that whilst it is still his thought that the inexorable fate of the universe and of the human race is to die, he sees that as a communal effort. And I think, and in multiple occasions, he usually writes, happy will be humanity when it sinks into the arms of absolute annihilation. Mm. So it's strange. He writes in this very prophetic and often joyous tone. And I think that's what makes him such a strange author to read, because it's like the beginning of it is very, very Kantian. It's very strictly logical. It's very mathematical in the way it's laid out. And he, like Schopenhauer, openly claims the simplicity of his system. And he sees himself as a continuation of Schopenhauer, but he does not advise suicide, I think would be the main point of that. Yeah.
Do you see him as an optimist then, of a sort?
He calls a pessimist someone who is ripe for death. That's his word. He's similar in Schopenhauer's way, where Schopenhauer sees liberation from the will as coming from an ascetic renunciation of all of the various lines that tie you to life. He does not see that as any different from a usual suicide, and because of his embracement of fatalism, his view is kind of just it doesn't matter. Anything that you're going to do was ordained at the beginning of the universe by what he calls the pre-worldly unity, and he often uses God as a metaphor. But he also, another misconception about Mainlander is that he is this prophet of the decaying corpse of God, which is a phrase that never appears in his writings and is hinted at metaphorically, and it's a rhetorical device that he uses to get across his palliation of Kant's thing in itself as what lies before the universe, and how he sees himself as solving all of Kant's antinomies of pure reason, like the finitude of the universe and necessity and freedom. So yeah, it's so strictly fatalistic that it cannot really invite an emotional response that isn't completely dependent on the reader reading it. And he also writes in the book that the truth of his philosophy can draw someone just as equally into the affirmation of the will and into more like boundless life, whatever that would mean, or into death immediately. And he's kind of open to either.
Okay. Let's jump back. So you begin, as you just mentioned it there a little bit, and the fatalism clearly plays a key role, and this is how you begin your writing on this, is really to do with time and how time works. So I don't know if you want to go over, because there's sort of a couple of theories of time that you use, and then you get through to Mainlanders. So I don't know if you want to sort of go through those, or you know what the temporal question was for you that got you here.
Well, yeah, I think the quite arrogantly, I wanted to just try and go deeper into the question of what happens after death. Seems almost like a childish endeavor to do in philosophy, but I think it's the most intimate question that we can grapple with. And in order to conceive of what it would mean for there to be an absence of time, you have to quite rigorously unpack what time is in its first place. And beginning from Kant, time is, of course, no longer seen as this sort of like Newtonian procession that is the universe, and we're just players within time. It's a scaffold that the understanding creates to order the perceptions that we see, the rhapsody of perceptions, as he calls it. So with regards to Mainlander, there's usually, I think in philosophy, there's kind of a discrepancy between like physical understandings of time, physics, and philosophical understandings of time. And I think that Mainlander is able to resolve, through Mainlander and Schopenhauer, is able to resolve some of the sort of things left open, specifically that question of what happens after death. And the reason I chose the word Eternism to start the thesis, or it's kind of like the phrase I use that I took from Benjamin de Casseret's writing on Nietzsche, is that it's like a deliberate play on eternalism as the standpoint in contemporary philosophy of physics since McTaggart, that there is no the opposite of presentism is that it's the block universe theory of Einstein and Kurt Gödel. It's that we are the thing I used in the sort of epigram at the beginning, which is the quote from Herman Weyl, which says, "The objective world simply is, it does not happen. Only to the gaze of my consciousness crawling upward along the lifeline of my body does a section of this world come to life as a fleeting image in space, which continuously changes in time." Which is, Schopenhauer sees his philosophy, and so does Mainlander, as just sort of as an unpacking of Kant's ideality of time. Both of them accept only his metaphysics. They both reject his ethics. So it's taking Kant back to purely just the critique of pure reason and the transcendental aesthetic, and using that to at least broach a possible answer to that question, which I think is it's analogous to theories of the absolute used by Hegel and Schelling, because it has to discuss the totality of the universe and our place within it as an individuated being. And it's also analogous to Nietzsche's eternal return, as once again, like Mainlander, another like rhetorical strategy to try and capture this quite strange thought that's very like Schopenhauer is very esoteric, I think, but I think he slightly gets it wrong with his metaphysics of transcendental everlasting of the individual, because he sees the universe as being infinite in time and in space, and he doesn't accept finitude when it comes to his universe, whereas Mainlander does. And I think the combination of those two makes it more appealing to contemporary thinking.
Can we read Mainlander as, a strange form of, this is playing devil's advocate in a way, because it might be what a lot of people think, but it seems almost then that this acceptance of finitude, that Mainlander's time really is nothing more than what many contemporary secular people would say is, when you die, and you're gone.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of philosophy to get to that point.
Yeah. It certainly is. And it's like, I think at work behind Schopenhauer and Mainlander's conception is that Mainlander's conception is deeply Christian, deeply, which he admits itself, where it's like the individual is annihilated in death and redemption comes afterwards. Now, Mainlander's redemption isn't the kingdom of heaven, but it is sort of his own kingdom of heaven, which is nothingness. And in some way, he writes that the nirvana of Buddhism, the Christian kingdom of heaven, and absolute nothingness are all one and the same thing. Yeah. So, but it's once again admitting that it's attempting to go beyond the bounds of pure reason and be like, it is absolute nothingness, but absolute nothingness is not something that can be experienced by a subject. So,
But
it has,
it is still a thing, not a thing, but it is still.
it is. Mainlander would say it is still, but I think he sees it as liberation, whereas I think I would see it more as a sort of primordial dead end that's in temporality itself, when it's a really quite upsetting imprisonment that the subject finds itself in when it is subjected to time and succession, because that is all it knows. It's all it's able to grasp. It is just its own lifeline. That's why the 4-dimensional analogy is useful, because I think that it's when it's conceived in such a way, it's like it allows one to see one's life as the analogy that Theodore Sider uses is like tracing your finger along the length of a branch, and then if you imagine your life in space and time like that, it's tracing your finger along the length of a branch and then wondering where it goes when you reach the end of the branch. It doesn't go anywhere. It simply just is a life that you are living.
And
right.
as per the block theory of time, that branch is already done.
Yeah.
And it always has been done.
Yeah. And there's no room for freedom at all. But obviously, that's a deeply counterintuitive notion that I think a lot of contemporary philosophers still want to find a place for. And I think that's why it's useful to go from Mainlander, Schopenhauer, and Kant, because it allows it's like an escape route, a tributary in intellectual history that doesn't involve the sort of confusions of Hegel's insistence on freedom or Schelling's insistence on freedom, which are, of course, beautifully grand and intricate systems, but I think it's bleaker and more simple in the eyes of Schopenhauer and Mainlander. Yeah.
So I mean, maybe just to, because there's this. So you've spoken about this sort of the redemption is this nothing that is still but isn't.
Yeah.
It's kind of strange and intuitive. Is it a form of? Would you say it's a form of being, or is it being itself?
It's being in similar to the way that Heidegger understands it, which was a great it was a great moment for me reading Heidegger when he writes at the question of in one of his lectures before being in time. I think it's the history of the concept of time, where he writes that when you're inquiring about this question, it goes from what is time to who is time. And he writes that time is just the temporalized present that beings experience in the world. It's not anything else apart from that experience within the world. And yeah, it's somewhat mystical, which is and it's somewhat could be like broached in terms of various esoteric religions and things, which is why I think it's such a fascinating singularity in this discussion, because it's kind of the unutterable, but I'm desperately trying to utter it.
So yeah, well, so I mean, perhaps if I was to give what the common sort of two or three sentence thing that is given for Mainlander that a lot of people know is this idea that God, whatever that means for Mainlander, comes into being, has a realization that it was better to not be, or to be in whatever Mainlander calls the redemptive state, and so creates or is dispersed as itself into the world as everything.
Yeah.
Therein, the entire point of the world is simply to die out, as to once again reach that conclusion that it's better to not be.
Yeah.
So the whole purpose for Mainlander, the whole purpose of everything is simply to get to the point of non-realization, we could say, because there's nothing to realize it. It's not a realization that it was always better to
not be. Now, is there any, if that's somewhat right, is there any key misrepresentations there? Because that, I think, is the go-to that a lot of people have now for Mainlander, from what we have. You know, the
Yeah,
translation is relatively recent, so that's still the meme, if you want to say.
yeah. Well, no, I think that's far more accurate than what the previous, I guess, conception was, which was of the decaying corpse of God.
Mm-hmm.
But his reasoning and how he gets to that point is strange. I can see some people levying critiques that it is possibly dubious, because the way he gets to that point is not through any knowledge of thermodynamics or heat science, which he was around for at the time. And Ulrich Horstmann says that he doesn't get it from that. He gets it from simply just mythopoetic sensitivity.
Nice.
And it's that he sees in everything as obviously a ceaseless striving, but just a dissipation. And he uses the analogy of liquid quite a lot, which is obviously a common analogy used in discussions of thermodynamics as well. And the reason he says he in a sort of Aristotelian way, he traces all of the things that you can observe in the universe back to a single cause. That is what it's kind of like Aristotle's prime mover. That's his conception of God. And
does it matter for him what, you know, does the epistemology of the prime mover matter as to why, or is he more sort of analytical in the sense, well, that's like, he's super analytical in that sense. He's like, that is the reason that is happening is because he's kind of just like, that is clearly what is happening. Which is there clearly has been that.
Yeah, there clearly has been that. We can see it.
Okay.
And yeah, and he takes that to be self-evident through all phenomena of the universe, and that's where he changes Schopenhauer's will to life to the will to death, which is really just the sort of I remember Nick Land writes somewhere in a discussion of Freud, he writes it's the hydraulic tendency to the dissipation of intensities. It's that sort of impersonal dissipation. Whereas Schopenhauer sees...
Yeah, there does seem to be a difference between the active and passive there, because there's an activity of life, whereas death is, try avoid it, right? All of that which is life eventually has to give way to the will to death.
Yeah, and that's why, returning to his ethics, he sees it as the job of... when he writes that happy will humanity be when it sinks into the arms of death, because life, he takes the broad strokes of Schopenhauer's philosophy as true as well, that life is ceaseless striving, misery, want, lamentation. When that's when a goal is reached, ennui and boredom set in. So he takes that as completely correct. And I guess the kind of the citizen of the world in Mainlander's case is someone who he wants to... He's a feminist. I think he was part of like the free love movement. Like, he's very progressive, but it's all with this undertone that everything should be aiming for this enlightenment, where the whole of humanity realizes that it would be better to not be than it would be to be. But he's not like people like Edward von Hartmann, where he's not, or like Ulrich Horstmann himself, who are suggesting that we should annihilate ourselves by nuclear means or something like that. He has got no desire to discuss the how he...
Well, does that matter if fatalism is...
Yeah, it does not matter at all. Which is the exact... it's a difficult line to write, because he's constantly flipping between that coin of it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter anyway. It's going to happen regardless. But he also is like advocating for people striving for this sort of enlightened state of realization of his own truth, I guess, which is that life is miserable. Yeah.
So what do we? I mean, is there any action? Is there anything to be done for Mainlander within this regard? Just to try get in line, which is itself to realize that the point is will to death.
Yeah. Well, it's strange. It's like it's not it's sort of irresolvable dialectic about. It's like the Metzinger's thing about, is it possible for someone to actually realize that they are, like, to be a determinist without going completely insane? And it's almost impossible to verbalize sort of specific side, one or the other, because they're both completely, they're both two sides of the same fatalistic coin. Yeah, it's very strange, and it's really almost nauseating to think about, especially when he's trying to advocate for some sort of political program.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he's going, well, it doesn't matter, because whatever you do, he uses the phrasing like, whatever you do is exactly what you had to do at the start of the universe. And the way he, another metaphor he uses at the end in the metaphysics section of the book is that he says that everything you're doing right now, you chose to do in the pre-worldly unity. And like, it's the exact thing that was necessary for you to reach absolute peace and nothingness.
So there's something intriguing there, because if you're saying it's already sort of baked into this initial becoming, let's say.
Yeah.
So there's sort of two options there. Is it the case that from this becoming, within the becoming, there are let's say natural or universal mechanisms that are entropic and run down, and it just so happens that everything is caught within them? Or is it the case for Mainlander that from this becoming, within the becoming is actually a sort of explicit teleology of, here is how I become as to die, like an actual decision of death, as opposed to that which is simply happens to eventually die? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. Well, it's once again, it's a difficult tandem between the two, because he does agree that there is, like, clearly there must be a sort of decision. There's an actual teleological and qualitative difference between someone who is, as he says, not ripe for death or is ripe for death. But at the same time, he says that exact decision was obviously already preordained. It was always going to happen, as it was. There's something quite Calvinist about that. It's deeply, like, predestinate. But yeah, and that's how he sees himself. He says, now freedom is united with necessity, because the world was born of a free act, the decision not to be, but everything within it conspires completely because of, out of necessity and out of causal relations and nothing else. It's really.
But it's not. But also, is it more than causal relations? Because there is this quote that I took down: "The world is this from Mainlander. The world is the means to the end of non-being, and specifically, the world is the sole means possible to that end." So, it's not being is included in this as well.
Yeah, and it's once again a sort of, that specific quote as well is another way to illustrate his reasoning, where he's just like, the world is the means to the end of non-being, and he reaches that by his conclusion that it began from this single point and is progressing in this entropic manner, and that's how he gets to that point, when he, with his, like, the combination of that and his firm embracement of fatalism, he kind of reaches it by way of the inside, of just suggesting, well, this is clearly what's happening, so that must be what's happening, which is an interesting use of reason. But yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating. I really do. It's really difficult to talk about, but
well, it's funny because you almost get in the same binds as Schopenhauer, because Schopenhauer's system, whether or not philosophers agree that he did complete it, he certainly attempted to tie it up with a bow, finish it. And it's very difficult to talk about systems of philosophy that are like that. And we see here Mainlander does a pretty good continuation. But equally, then, I don't know, I guess ties the bow even tighter, right? And it's very difficult to know what to do with philosophy. We go, well, especially when fatalism is concerned, because if we were to sort of step into Mainlander's world and just fully agree with it for the time being, everything I am now saying to you and whatever you reply to me is already done. And so
Yes.
what is to be done with Mainlander's system is that which will always be done with his system. It doesn't. So it seems to be it's beyond mattering and not mattering. There is no decision of that now.
Yeah. Yeah, which is, it's beyond mattering, not mattering. It's beyond the sort of, as you've called it, the belief in the now pessimism, which seeks to be prescriptive and just sort of in a Gnostic manner, just lament the whole of the universe as either miserable or joyous. It's completely beyond that. It's just purely a remorseless unfolding of.
But it's not remorseless, because I think I don't mean to criticize you, but I'm just saying there's very intriguing connotations that come with fatalism that actually negate, because it's almost like, is suffering if it has to be?
Yeah.
The decision of, is something evil if there was no other option?
Yeah.
Everything's sort of folded away. And so, well,
Yeah.
you could say fatalism seems to collapse all relativism into nothing.
Yeah. And it's even more, and I think it's one of the key differences as well with Mainlander and Schopenhauer, is that whilst Schopenhauer is also fatalistic, he also sees there's still perhaps you can call it a somewhat pious element to his thinking of the will is still, we are being puppeted within the world by the will. We're being, so I think as a literary strategy, that's I think like beautiful. I think that's why like Ligotti is the Schopenhauerian thinker par excellence, because that's all his stories are concerned with, that nightmarish puppeteering of our daily life.
That's an intriguing question to maybe bridge the two a bit more explicitly. What happens to that puppeteering between Schopenhauer and Mainlander?
It goes from, it becomes colder and more detached. There's no longer a force that's puppeteering everything in lockstep. Well, there is, but it's sort of, Schopenhauer tries to describe the will, and he uses, it's his substitute for Kant's thing in itself. So he like writes that it is one, but it is beyond oneness. It's beyond like all concept of multiplicity, and obviously that's a deeply mystical connotation. But with mind, that, and he sees it as infinite. He sees that there's going to be an infinite renewal of races and nations and peoples, whereas for Mainlander, it is still just as bleak, and it's still just as awful, but it's singular and finite, and it's just contained within the bounds of this universe, which is,
there's no chance of it. No chance of this whole process starting again at some point for Mainlander.
I don't think he doesn't really entertain the question.
Okay.
I don't think he sees it necessary in the teleological progression that he's described, and because he's writing under the like epistemological shackles of Kant, it doesn't matter, because we are the sensuous feeling aspect of being is all there will ever be. And it's like, it's playing with the idea of be as that that I think like Choron calls it the asylum of the existing, where it's just the use and abuse of that auxiliary verb, which is the sort of bleakness that we're getting at with Mainlander, because it just is. It's what's happening right now. Is this happening here right now? And that's all there ever will be, which is quite.
But it's all will ever be. But the because of the move from infinite to finite, the verb becomes a noun, right? It's almost like to go back to the branch analogy. The branch is the branch, so it is a noun. It's a thing that's done.
Yeah.
So what was once sort of verbing in the infinite is now nouning in the finite.
I love that way of phrasing that. Yeah.
Well, not nouning. It's done.
It's done. Yeah, and
great.
Yeah, all the like entrapments that we use in language are like are just kind of aching at trying to word that, but I'm not sure if it ever can be worded. It's deeply confusing.
Well,
Yeah.
it's paradoxical because you don't have any relative stuff to sort of deal with it. Because I think specifically because of that the temporal fatalism. Once that is once that is,
Yeah.
what?
Yeah. That's
what
like
more is there? What can you?
exactly.
Well, you can say once that is, whatever you say is said. That sounds so redundant, but
It's true, and like I guess it's like the this this entire conversation that we're having is dancing between those 2 points, and the medium of it being a conversation, trying to articulate what we know, what if we take to be self-evident has already been ordained to be articulated. It's almost comical.
yeah. So if you don't get anything from this conversation, that's actually not. There is no relative position to take. It's no one's fault. Never was anyone's fault. It just was. The end of this branch is already there. So if you click dislike or like, we're beyond that.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
But what about Eternism, which is Eternism is sort of the conclusion that which is, again, back to Cassara's, that's where your thesis sort of ends up, is this position of Eternism.
Yeah. Well, I think the place my thesis end up is the shore that we've already reached in this discussion, whereas like Mainlander, he insists on what he writes of nothingness and of non-being as a place that can be experienced, which cannot be the case, and it can be strived for and strived towards, which also, as per admission of his own metaphysics, can't be the case. So it's just deepening that fatalism that I think is implicit in both of the systems, that is kind of outlined by the transcendental aesthetic and Kant's ideality of time, and using that to bridge that with that branch analogy and say it's already done, and the arc that your life occupies in the temporal procession of things is all that there ever will be. But obviously, we're locked into the present. The seat of consciousness, as Mainlander phrases it, like rides on a permanent now. It's also the part of Schopenhauer's thinking as well. He writes, the life of every animal species throughout the millennia of its existence is really to a certain degree akin to a single moment, for it is mere consciousness of the present without that of the past or future, and therefore of death. In this sense, it should be seen as an enduring moment or a permanent now, but a now that consists only of the existence of every other now, and the distinction between this now and another now and a previous now loses all meaning. Yeah.
Did he write anything after Philosophy of Redemption?
Mainlander.
Yeah.
He wrote the first volume, and then I believe he wrote 3 untranslated novels, one of which was kind of like like he had 2 characters representing different sides of his philosophy, and they're kind of in dialogue with each other. And then he wrote what is, I believe, known as just the 12 philosophical essays, which includes like a critique of Edward von Hartmann. And I think he never published that, and it was just after so he wrote all of that and never published any of it. And it was just obviously after the publishing of the first volume that he then died.
Yeah.
So he did write more, and I guess it's another reason why talking about him, I think, is for my own selfish reasons. I want more attention to be drawn to him because
they're not selfish, because it's already either is or it is or it isn't, right?
That's true. Mainlander's puppeteering this from 200 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other conversation out of Mainlander on here was not necessarily short, but it is this problem of what to do. I mean, it's an abstract question, but do you think anyone can go anywhere from Mainlander in the way that he did from Schopenhauer? I mean, I'm kind of asking you to sort of drum up some new system of philosophy there, but do you see, perhaps maybe the question would be, do you see any legitimate, I mean, within the bounds of his own logic, do you see any legitimate sort of places for an opening or cracks in his system where you think, well, maybe that's an avenue that might take this above the bounds of its death?
I think that the only possible route would be to provide some sort of texture or some scaffolding to the degrees of freedom within his system. So perhaps there's a Marxist response to Mainlander's system, which is to work out more specifically exactly if there is any way we can breach out of this fatalistic loop. Whether that's possible, I would probably say no. But I also think it leaves room for a lot of for art more so. And as we've discussed before with Schopenhauer's aesthetics, it's art in their systems is the way to step back from the churning of the world and perceive just the idea, just the principium individuationis in its nakedness. And I think it invites people to create paradoxically just as much as it does to do anything else, as per admission for his Zen system. I don't know, but it's something that like I'm keen to continue.
Are you a Mainlanderian? Are you in agreement with his worldview?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, then you've got no choice whether or not you agree with it.
Exactly. So I guess it's just wait to see what was ordained for me at the beginning of the universe is the only answer that can be in that question. It's sort of like in Maurice Blanchot's The Instant of My Death, he writes that it could all be told in 10 words. That's what makes it so horrifying. The sort of simplicity of it is the scary part.
Mm. Yeah, it is simple.
Mm.
Anything you'd like to add?
I don't know. I think there's certainly a place for literature in this. There's a very literary dimension to Mainlander. And I think there's a great deal of writers now that are writing with his sort of themes and are reaching the same level of sort of bleakness that he did, but are still creating. I'm thinking of people like obviously your recent book of stories. I would wholeheartedly place that there. People like a lot of them are relatively unheard authors, like another person called Jacob H. Kyle has a book of sort of Sharon-esque aphorisms that reach a similar place that Mainlander do. Gary Shipley, Andrei Solnikar. Yeah, I know. I think it paradoxically invites people to create. I think in the sort of ashes of what his conclusion is, to try and express it in better ways than I've just spent the last hour trying to do.
Well, it's a lot of this philosophy. I think once you have a conclusatory, it's not even a word, philosophy, there becomes the paradox of why continue to speak.
Yeah.
But as per our nature,
yeah,
we speak and we try to articulate. And so what's left to do is to try to speak when we willfully know that there's nothing left to be said.
Yeah, you'd think perhaps Aquinas had it right in his infamous silence at the end of life, where he just said, "It's all straw to me now." Perhaps that's the only logical conclusion: is that is just silence. Knows.
Yeah. Well, we'll find out. Maybe, or we won't.
Maybe.
Are you going to continue working on Mainlander?
I think he's gonna haunt me in everything I do. I think, like he has done for years now already. Which I see as a good thing. It's quite like he did with Schopenhauer, and like Schopenhauer did with Kant. Yeah, I think it's going to be a constant reference point for me, this book, and I sincerely hope that someone translates the rest of his work, whether Christian Rollins is not wholly fed up. Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. Seems like a good moment. I mean, it's the only place to finish up. If we finish up here, it's the only place. It's already decided.
Yeah.
Where can we find your work? Do you have a blog yet, or anything along those lines?
I do not. I have my only sort of like public presence, I guess, is on Twitter, which is just my name, Jacob McMillan. But I do intend on setting up a blog soon, so keep an eye out, I guess.
I will do. I'll be sure to put the new translation as well, a link for that in the description below, so they can get a few more eyes on the.
Yeah, certainly. I really do think it's a worthwhile read for everyone, especially in academia. Because despite how its conclusions are quite suffocating, I think it's less suffocating than the position a lot of contemporary academia is in now. So yeah.
Wow, Jacob McMillan, thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.